So hello again, everyone. Today, we are talking about how to prepare effectively for upcoming job interviews, internship interviews, interviews with employers in general. And so we're going to cover a broad range of topics relevant to that. And you'll see that many of these topics are building on some of the things that we've talked about in the last few days, some of the other sessions that we've covered. And so hopefully that preparation work that we've been talking about will make this process of putting together an effective interview strategy much more effective. Let's start off with some introductions. I am Dr. Joseph Barber. I lead one of the teams at Career Services that works with graduate students and postdocs. This workshop week is primarily set for graduate students and postdocs, so I try to make this as relevant to this population as possible. If you are not a graduate student or postdoc, welcome anyway. We do not like to exclude, we like to include, so feel free to join along and take away any best practices that you can. In terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to sort of think about the different phases of work that you can be doing, right? Preparing for a job interview can actually happen months before you even have the interview to a certain extent, and we'll touch on why that's the case. But obviously there's things to do right as you know that you have an interview coming up. There's a sort of to really wrap up the research that you're doing and be able to be confident when you come to that interview scenario. So we'll touch on all of these different phases going through this process. Now, the before job interview phases do include a lot of the things that we have been talking about, right? So that does include networking with people who've had jobs or internships at that organization, who are there right now, who are in your network, right? That's going to be fundamentally important. Looking at that job posting, obviously creating a cover letter that reflects that, and then getting to the point where you can actually have the interview. So let's sort of break down these different steps a little bit more, right? So the networking component allows you to answer questions. Remember, I said that the key part of networking is to come to networking with a set of questions that you want answered, and then to find the right people to give you answers to those questions. So these are some of the questions that, as part of your networking, you can get a sense of, because these are some of the things that will intersect with you during the job interview itself. They're going to be asking questions that are coming from their perspective, their point of view. The company culture may inform the types of interview scenarios that you face, right? So lots of things there that I think are going to be important to think about. The job posting, right? So the job posting obviously lists the skills and the responsibilities of the role. So in an interview, they're going to be asking you about those skills and responsibilities. And so you need to understand everything about what that job actually means. You can't sort of guess and go, well, I'll figure it out when I get there. Even though you will be able to learn quickly on the job, you need to have some latent knowledge about what these roles actually mean in practice, in reality, not just in theory. So asking questions and understanding what that is going to be important as well. The resume and cover letter that you put together is your story, right? Beginning to articulate your skills. And so in terms of preparing for a job interview, not only do you have to sort of write them down and sort of spend weeks working on the resume, but then you have to make it come to life in the way that you're talking about it. And so creating these narratives around how to talk about these skills in action and make them come to life, and making sure that you as the person being interviewed is drawing from your materials. Obviously, you don't want to bring in totally new material, but you definitely do want to add to the material that you've already sent in your materials. You can't just repeat the same material either. And then when you have that invitation to interview, the questions then becomes, well, what else can I do? If I've done all these things, what else is it that I'm doing? So the idea is obviously that once they see your application materials, they're excited by that version of you. And you have to continue to build on that excitement, not by just saying the same things, because that sort of keeps you at the same level, that keeps you at the plateau, but by being able to make that come to life in more informative ways. So making sure that you are able to really demonstrate these elements, and not just demonstrate them based on what you've done, but based on how those things can integrate into the culture, the organization that you're going into. So understanding them and telling your stories through their perspectives is going to be helpful. Ultimately, it is going to involve a lot more research, which is great because you all have research backgrounds, and that's something that a lot of people are comfortable in. So let's think about what that research might look like. And we have sort of a continuum here from things that are just general to things that are perhaps more pen specific in terms of the networks that you might have access to. Don't overlook all the information that an employer puts out there about itself, right? In this day and age, any large organization, and obviously the larger the organization, the more this is going to be true, every large organization has all the social media channels. They're always trying to put content out about themselves, talk about their projects, talk about their people. And so, for example, here is the Deloitte website and the Deloitte information about, first of all, they have a explore your fit, find out what jobs you might like to do at Deloitte. So that's sort of an exploration process. But then they have all of these stories, these individual narratives from people who work there, their own perspectives, their own journeys. And yes, it may take a while to go through all of these, but you'll learn so much just by being an active listener, by listening to the way that they describe their role, their journey, what they benefit from that experience. And so it's all freely accessible. You don't have to find these people. You don't have to start a conversation with these people. You're just absorbing it. But it's the kind of thing that can really make a difference in an interview scenario where someone asks you a question, then you say, oh, I was actually on your website and I heard a person talk about that, one of the stories, and I found that really inspiring, right? It helps, again, decrease the gap between you and the organization by being able to use that information. So much information out there that I would sort of encourage you to look at and view. They have an Instagram, they have Twitter, they have their LinkedIn profile, and there may be overlap in the information, but there's also going to be different perspectives of that information, different people sharing in different voices in different ways. And so the more that you can absorb that for any organization, the better off you're going to be. So do take a while to do this sort of deep dive. I really want to learn everything about this organization. Again, for organizations that don't have a big web presence, it's not going to take you long, but you can certainly see what they posted on LinkedIn. You can certainly see if there's anything, in the news about them, whatever it is, right? But the more information that you have about them, the better. McKinsey, for example, just picking on some big firms, just to illustrate it, it has a whole bunch of YouTube videos on them, on what they do, on what they think and what they feel. And they have all this information on their website about the process that you're going to be going through in terms of the interview and what that looks like. So a lot of confidence building there just by having all this information in your brain already. Nothing's going to be surprising because you've already looked through all these processes and you understand them. So that deep dive process is really going to help you get comfortable. The more confident you are and comfortable you are, the easier it is for you to portray the value that you bring to an organization. So a really important part. Don't overlook the sort of social media info dump that's out there. And when you go through this information, here are some things that you can take away from that, right? So again, just like with networking, you're listening for the language that they're using to describe their roles so that you can use similar language to describe your experiences, decreasing the sort of the gap between you and them by demonstrating that you understand the nature of the work that's there. When all these videos will be positive videos, if a company's put them out there, they're not going to be people trashing the organization. So when people talk about what they enjoy, ask yourself, would I enjoy something similar, to that? Is that something that brings me energy? And can I articulate that, right? So when someone says, well, why do you want to work here? Why do you want to work in this department, this division? You can say, I heard a couple of videos, people talked about this. That's so exciting for me, right? Not only do I want to bring my skills, but I want part of that experience too. And again, that makes it seem much more authentic because you're not just saying, oh, I hope to grow as a leader in this organization. You're basing it on something that's actually out there. And then all this information that you're reading, you may still have questions about the organization, about the role. Those can still become networking questions, or they can become the questions that you ask in the interview itself. And that's going to be helpful because you want to ask smart questions that demonstrate that you've done some of the research already. So that's sort of the company information that's out there. We talked about Glassdoor as one of the resources that you can definitely use to look at interview questions that might be arising, right? So if you log into Glassdoor, create your sort of free account by sharing a bit of information about your experience, then you can view the 1,000 interviews or the 1,000 posts that people have shared about what their interview experience was like. And sometimes you can do it by job role, by function, by department, by division. If they say that it was a full day event and they had this and they had this and they were asked these types of questions, doesn't mean that that's what it's going to look like for you, because companies certainly are very, they're broad and they have different departments that do different things. But it gives you a little bit of confidence to say, well, if that does come up, then I'm going to be ready for it. I know that might come up, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time working on that one. So you can do this on Glassdoor. You can also do this on Handshake. You can go to the employer pages on Handshake and see student versions of their interview experience for different companies, right? So Glassdoor is not specific to universities, so these are professionals and students and everyone else. So again, just another source of information that's going to allow you to sort of walk away with knowledge about what you can be doing to prepare. Right now, you know that these types of questions come up. Now you can create a strategy to help you figure that out. And these are just examples of the types of posts that people give on Glassdoor. So the interview process had 4 phases: screening with HR. The third step was a series of 30-minute interviews with the team. Right. So every team will do it slightly differently. So don't expect to match it exactly. But I feel like having any idea of the landscape that's out there is going to be really helpful. One of the things that I dislike personally is not knowing what to expect. But if I know that there might be these things, then mentally I can be much better prepared to deal with that. So again, you can see that each interview is sort of titled with the type of role that it is, so you can narrow those down as you're exploring those different options on Glassdoor. Then we have sort of LinkedIn as an example again of how to connect with people who have more of the answers that you can't find online or still have about an organization. We've talked about this a couple of times. For those of you who have not been a part of my previous sessions, I'm just going to run through quickly what that's going to look like. So the LinkedIn alumni finder tool, and again, I'm going to put the links in here to the chat so that you can find out these platforms. Also, don't forget, you can ask your questions in the chat if you have any. I'm keeping an eye on it in the background. So as I go through this, I'm just going to keep talking at you, but jump in with questions and I'm happy to stop. So you can find and scroll through, I think it's around 170, 180, it changes on a daily basis, 180,000 Penn alumni and current students broken down by information, and filter those alumni or those people in your network who might have insights into the organizations that you're particularly interested in. So for example, on LinkedIn, this alumni tool allows you to filter by where they live, geographically, where they work, the role that they play, the job function, what they studied, what they're skilled at, and how you're connected to them, right? So these are all filterable things that you can add in, and then you can see those people based on whatever criteria that you're filtering on. So really helpful if you're trying to track down someone to connect with. So again, if I'm interested in someone who works at Google, I used Google as my example before, who's a secondary connection to me, which means I don't know them on LinkedIn, I'm not connected to them on LinkedIn, but I'm connected to someone who is connected with them, which helps me start a conversation much more easily. Then I have 108 second-degree connections at Google. Jessica here is just an example of one of them, and my connection here is Amy. I know Amy through my professional association. And so if I wanted to reach out to Jessica because I knew that Jessica had an experience that might be helpful to me, or I know that Jessica can help me answer a question that is specific to Jessica's experience, because again, that's what you're trying to sort of accomplish here, then I can work through Amy to sort of make that happen. And that's an easy way to start. Again, if I'm reaching out to someone pre-interview, that I have a scheduled interview, I'm going to be I'd recommend being very upfront and open and say, hi, Jessica, I'm reaching out to you. I do have an interview scheduled at Google in the next 2 weeks for this type of role. I noticed that you have this. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Please let me know if you think that's appropriate for me to, if you're happy or comfortable chatting with me prior to this interview. I totally understand if that, doesn't work for you, but I did want to reach out because your experience is so rich and will be so helpful to me as I am preparing myself for that role. So again, you're not asking them to do anything for you that you're not doing for yourself. You're doing all the hard work to try to prepare. You're just trying to get an insight from that person. But in some organizations, they probably don't want to speak. Some people don't want to speak with candidates before they're interviewing. If people are applying for a job, in my team, I'd love to speak with them beforehand just to get a sense of, their interests and to help them be as successful as possible at highlighting the things that I would be looking for, so that it makes our committees work easier to find the right person, as it were. Nadia here, if I was doing for a Viacom job search again, so any company that you're interested in, you can throw in there. Now, the interesting thing here about Nadia's profile is if I take a closer read at it, right down at this bottom here, it says, please do not hesitate to contact me as I'm always open to meeting people. Now, that doesn't mean that Nadia can stop everything that she's doing and answer all your questions, but it is a great way to start a conversation to say, hey, Nadia, I see that you are working at Viacom CBS. I'm really excited in roles that are there. We share a connection in common. Sibel said you'd be a great person to reach out to. I also noticed that you'd be happy to reach out to people. On your LinkedIn summary, it said you'd be comfortable for people reaching out to you. So here I am. And so, just mentioning the fact that she said this is going to probably more likely tip the scales in favor of Nadia responding, because she'd be like, oh yes, I did say that. I should respond. So, be very observant about what you're seeing in terms of people's profiles and what they're saying, because that's a great way of starting a conversation and taking advantage of that. So again, going back to this idea, why are you asking, at this point in time, we've talked about networking in the past, and networking be doing all the time, but why are you asking people now, right, as you have a sort of an interview coming up on the horizon, to help, what are you doing in these conversations with these alumni, with these connections? So a hiring manager or hiring managers in general, when they invite you for an interview, they already see potential in your experience, your skills, and your knowledge, right? They're excited by something in a resume. You may not know exactly what it is because they may have a very, specific idea in their heads about what they're looking for, but they know that you have some of the knowledge necessary. They know that you have some of the skills necessary, even if those skills are picking up new skills quickly. You've illustrated in your materials that you've been successful, that you have great outcomes and results in the work that you're doing. And they certainly feel like some of your actual experiences are relevant because that's why they want to speak with you more. But they have a couple of areas that they don't necessarily know about from your background, right? Can this person really demonstrate and really talk through an example of how what they've done in the past speaks to what they'll be doing in this role? And is this candidate going to really be a good person to fit within the team structure, within the the growth opportunities in the organization? Do they understand the nature of the organization and what the goals are, and all the elements of sort of that fit? Now, fit is it's an intangible concept. There's no definition of what fit is, but obviously any hiring manager is going to be thinking about how who they're managing, what that looks like, how they can make that person's time at the organization, significant and promote their leadership skills, their professional skills, their career development skills, all those types of things. So the conversations that you're having with people then give you insight into some of these questions, right? They give you insight into the nature of the organization, what it looks like, what it feels like, how much they value X and Y. And it gives you insight into the stories that people are telling, so that when you tell your own stories in an interview, you're making them connected in some way to the experiences that are real to the hiring manager. The hiring manager sees your experience through their lens. They work in this role, they've done this role, they know the challenges. If they can see that you are able to articulate experiences that match those challenges and bring value to the role, they're going to be very excited. So that's why you're having these conversations, to really get at these more intangible aspects that are out there. When it comes to thinking about what's going to happen in the interview itself in terms of the questions to be preparing for, there are various categories of questions. And this is by no means is all of them, but I'm just going to sort of break it down into easy categories here. There's sort of the who are you as a professional questions, the why do you want this role questions, and then the sort of the behavioral-based questions. When have you done this? What does that look like? Give me an example of that. I would say there are always 5 questions that are asked in any job interview or internship interview scenario, right? 5 questions you should be extremely well prepared to answer, that should never be a surprise to you, that you don't want to have sort of a rehearsed, scripted answer to, but you're just very excited, very confident to ask these. And so those 5 questions, tell me about yourself, right? Sort of, we're going to be talking about that one after at 11 o'clock today. What do you know about us, right? You should always know something about them, and not, I know you're based in Seattle or something, right? You should have done your research to allow you to get closer to that information. Why do you want this job? Now, sometimes the tell me about yourself and the why you want this job sort of are combined. Can you tell me about yourself and let us know why you want this job? Sometimes they're separate, but you sort of need discrete answers for both of those, and you can certainly combine those together if necessary. What do you bring to this role, right? So this is really a strengths question. What's so great about you? What is your superpower? It was on a job description yesterday that we talked about. What is your superpower that you bring to this role that is going to bring value to me, the hiring manager, to the team, to the organization, to whatever it is, right? And then, do you have any questions for us? And the answer to that question in any job interview is always yes. You always have questions. It doesn't matter if they've answered every single question that you wrote down on a piece of paper. You need to always say yes. If you say no to that question, it really demonstrates disinterest in the organization, in the role. There's no way that you can know everything about the roles that are out there that you're applying to. So you really must have questions. So these are the ones that you want to be ready for. And then on the other side, there are behavioral-based questions, right? Where they're going to say, well, give me an example of a time where you've done X, Y, and Z. And so the questions become, well, what types of behaviors are they going to ask me about? What does that look like? And then how do I sort of make sure that I'm answering that question in the fullest extent? So this is just a list of behavioral-based questions. Obviously, there's sort of a measurable number of these things based on the different behaviors, the transferable skills, as it were, but also the scenarios that you can put people in. I shared links for this list of behavioral-based questions in the chat. You can find those in the box folder. But there's a lot of questions that are out there, and oftentimes there's one theme, one category like leadership, and then you can ask 17 different versions of that are subtly different, but are still trying to get at leadership skills. These behavioral-based questions are pretty common in I would say every job interview scenario. People always want to know how what you've done in the past will relate to what you're doing in the role. Now there are different elements of these questions, right? So if you're applying for consulting jobs, there's a whole bunch of case interview questions that you're going to get through, and then there's a behavioral component. If you're applying for industry interviews, they, to a certain extent, know from your publications, if you're doing into research and development in STEM fields, that you have the technical skills necessary. So they're not necessarily going to quiz you on that, but they are going to quiz you on how well you work as part of an interdisciplinary team or work on multiple projects at the same time. Those are the behavioral-based components there. So there may be more of those. If you're applying for faculty jobs, there's still going to be behavioral-based questions, about your research, about funding, about teaching, about mentoring. They're still going to be there. But obviously, for research-intensive roles, they may be prioritizing on what your future research actually looks like. But behavioral-based questions always a key component of that. So how do you then prepare for that immeasurable number of questions that exist out there? You can't obviously create a document where you've answered every one of those questions. That's not a good use of your time. It really goes back to this idea of doing a deep dive into the job description and your conversations with people who know about this job. So here's an example of a job. It's a learning and development project manager at Twitter. Let's walk through some of the responsibilities and qualifications that they're looking for, and then try to anticipate what types of questions that might come in an interview scenario. So one of the roles that they want you to do is to develop, manage, and track team budgets to ensure that they stay on track and the team has adequate funding. So if we think about the skills connected to this responsibility, that requires some quantitative skills, database skills, budget skills, generally speaking. It requires attention to detail. Any budget work requires you to be very attentive to line items and making sure that everything's there. And it requires strategic thinking, the way that you partition out a budget over the quarters, over the year, how to anticipate things. Those are the skills that are likely to be necessary to be able to do this task at this role. And so these three questions on the right-hand side are my thoughts about the types of questions that might come up in an interview based on those. Obviously, give an example of a time when you managed a budget, right? Because they want you to have some experience. When have you done more with less, right? So it's not really talking about a budget. So even if you have no budget experience, there's an opportunity to answer this question, based on anything that you've done. But it's sort of the same thought, right? How have you been able to take advantage of resources, limited resources to do something? And how have you adapted to changing budgets and maintain project success? So if you've been on a funding project and that's changed, what have you done to respond to that? All of those questions relate to this responsibility in one way or the other. Now, obviously, the hiring manager and the hiring team will have their own ideas about what the challenges are and will ask their own versions. But that is sort of the type of process that you want to go through as you're trying to anticipate those behavioral-based questions. Manage the operational cadence of the team to include staff, and team meetings, right? So this is sort of creating a team culture, as it were. So what they need here is sort of communication skills. They need you to be efficient with the time and the resources to build this team together. And obviously they need a team-based mindset to sort of make this work. So the types of questions that I would anticipate: how do you maintain effective communication within a team? And in our semi-remote world, especially when people are scattered all over the world, what's your way of bringing people together even though they're apart? How do you advocate for your team member, their ideas within your own meetings and other meetings, right? How do you support their input into the organization? What does a successful team look like to you? Describe your team right now, right? So these are all questions that would be good to anticipate. And probably, one answer might get to all of these three, for example, or a couple of answers. So it's not as if you have to have answers to each of these specific questions, but within the answers that you're thinking about, you need to be able to cover some of these components. Ensuring the right stakeholders are involved in the right way at the right time based on this decision-making model. So first of all, you have to figure out what this decision-making model is and understand that. Skills necessary: strategic thinking, be able to make a decision, that's a skill. Having good judgment, that's a skill. So how do you know when you need support from more senior staff to make a decision, right? So when do you go to your advisor for help in your research, or when do you just sort of power through it? These are questions that are still applicable, even as a student or a postdoc. What's the time when not everyone agreed with the decision that was made, and how did you do that? Some of your student work group might be a good example of that. And when have you been able to convince someone to change their decision, right? So these are all, again, example questions. We'll do, I think, one more time here. Proven ability to work in a fast-paced, dynamic, and entrepreneurial environment, and versatility to manage multiple projects, priorities, and urgent issues successfully and simultaneously. Lots in that particular responsibility, but the word that's important here is proven ability, right? And oftentimes you'll see demonstrated ability. That means that in an interview scenario, you really need to bring your example down to earth to a very specific thing. You can't just say, oh yes, I'm very comfortable juggling priorities across my PhD and my postdoc. I've always had to do that. That's not a proven ability. A proven ability is an actual example that demonstrates what that looks like with a nice outcome at the end of that. And so again, these are all questions that I might think about would be helpful to that process that you want to keep in mind. So any job that you're applying to pre-interview, you want to sort of go through again and have this sort of deep reflection about the types of behaviors that you think are a priority to them, because chances are those are the behaviors that they're going to be asking you about in these scenarios. Okay, we have one more here. Ability to think through problems, come up with innovative solutions. So again, problem solving, innovation, creativity, main skill sets there. Give an example of when you were creative. How do you brainstorm ideas? What's a problem you couldn't solve? So in the couple of these scenarios, you've seen that there's a sort of there are positive questions. Tell me how you've been successful. And there are sometimes negative questions. We'll circle back around to that one in a bit in the rest of this presentation. So what that means is that there's a whole bunch of skills that they're really looking for from a candidate. They really want to see come to life in the interview. And there's a whole bunch of skills, obviously, that you have and experiences that you have. And your goal is to find the stories about the skills that you have that you want to talk about, and make sure that those stories are the stories that really resonate with your audience, right? So this is effective communication, making sure that the stories that you're telling resonate with your audience so they can get excited by those stories. So obviously it's a really good idea to tell stories that you're most excited by, but if those stories are totally disconnected from the skills or the roles, then that's not going to be helpful. So really keeping your audience in mind as part of this process is going to be helpful. So when you're talking to connections, circling back around to this whole, chatting with people in real time, when you're talking with these connections, you can ask questions to, alumni who are out there in organizations. What are some of the challenges you face in your roles? And what are the skills that you use to overcome them, right? Then you listen to their story and you write some words down, you think about it. And then, when you get to an interview and they ask you, tell me about a challenge you faced in your previous role and how you overcame it. Your sort of job here is to tell your story, but to overlay it on the type of stories that you're hearing from people who actually work in the field, right? To make sure that your story, in terms of its story arc, matches some of what they talk about in terms of their stories. It should always be your story. You're not telling anyone else's story, but the way you tell the story and how you align it can be very much influenced by what you're hearing other people in the field say. So we were talking about stories in cover letters yesterday and stories in video interviews and those types of things. So we're going to touch on this quickly again, because obviously in interviews, you are the storyteller, right? You're verbally there, you're visually there, you're in real time there. Some of the ways that you want to tell stories really reflect some of the skills that are being brought up. So defining the skills, defining the concepts is helpful so that your story is automatically more relevant to your audience. Because again, these are examples of behavioral-based questions. You're not meant to read through all these, they're just examples. But in these three categories, critical thinking, decision-making, and leadership, the terms themselves mean different things to different people. My version of what I think leadership is and your version of what you think leadership is don't have to be the same thing. It's a broad concept. Critical thinking, it's an intangible and nebulous concept. And so if we're talking about slightly different things if one is talking about different thing from your interviewer when you're giving an example and they don't agree with your perspective on it, then there could be a disconnect here moving forward. So if the question that was asked in an interview is, give me an example of a time when you showed creativity in addressing challenges at work. As a candidate, you might say, well, sure, here's where I was creative in the role that I've done. Right, and you use examples X, Y, and Z. The interviewer, as they're sort of listening to this, might go, "Oh, that's interesting." But when I think about creativity in my role here, I think about A, B, and C. Right. So people are using slightly different language or different examples to talk about creativity in this concept. And if those examples don't overlap, if they sound very different, then obviously that's a disconnect. You're not aligning your experiences with the way that the hiring manager or the hiring team is thinking about the value of those experiences, because they are picturing one thing and you are picturing another thing. So the solution to this is to define the terms first, right? So if it's a term that's complex, that might have different interpretations, take a moment to say, well, to me, creativity means X, Y, and Z. It means taking in multiple perspectives. It means trying something new. And here's an example of how I've done that. And what that does is it puts you on the same page as your interviewer. If you define the term first and then give an example of that, of you using that skill set based on your definition, the interviewer won't have any, there won't be a disconnect. They won't be confused by it. They'll understand how you're defining creativity. And then they can sort of go, oh, I see why these things mean, creativity to you. And then they can say to themselves, yes, these are things that I can also see as part of my experience. So defining the term, first of all, gives yourself time to think when you're actually interviewing, right? So if you define the term, your brain is like catching up and going, wait a minute, I have an example here. But it also means that you're on the same page as the interviewer. And even if they define it somewhat differently, so long as they can see how you define it and how your examples match that, they're going to go with that. And it's going to be much easier for them to digest what that looks like. And then obviously what that means is that there is more overlap here because you are within a nice definition of the term creativity, right? You're talking about the same concept because you've defined that concept, and that's going to be helpful. You don't want to do that for everything, right? So if someone says, well, give me an example of a time when you've collaborated effectively, and you say, well, to me, collaboration means X, because sometimes the terms don't actually need definitions. Still, if you wanted to put your own take on it and give yourself more time to think, that's perfectly fine. But things like creativity, leadership, diversity, ambiguity, right? These things come up as concepts in behavioral-based interviews. Sometimes you do want to take a moment to define it so that you know that then you're talking about the same thing to the interviewer. But you can't just define it. Obviously, you then have to have an example that matches your definition so that then people can share in that experience with you. In terms of telling the stories in the interview, you have to structure your stories, right? So if I give, in a mock interview especially, if I give a question that says, give me an example of a time when you did X, there are many ways that people can start their answers to those behavioral-based questions. Oftentimes it's yes. So we were working on a project and what we found was X, right? And if you do that in a sort of interview scenario, what the interviewer is thinking is, what on earth is going on? Where are we? Who are we talking about? When was this? Where were you? What's going on, right? So there's no information here to sort of start the interviewer on the same page. It's just dumped right into the story, and that's really hard to do. So that's not a good, well-structured answer. This is another response that you often get for these sort of broad questions. Well, I think so. Well, it's probably 2 years, no, maybe 1 year, right? So this is the opposite, where you're trying to start, you're trying to give some information, but there's no linear narrative. It's all over the place. It's unstructured in that way. Again, not the best way to sort of start off one of these stories. And what's the interview saying? Oh no, how long is this going to take? How's this going to work out? As I mentioned in my resume, I was able to lead a project that worked out really well. So you never want to refer back to the material that got you the interview, right? So the resume gets you the interview, then you have to get you the offer, right? So the resume has done its job basically by the time you get to the interview. Then you have to make these experiences come to life. So always think forward from the resume, never focus back, because otherwise what happens is the person who's interviewing you, they may not have seen your resume, they may not have read it, and as they're looking for it right now in their paperwork, they are disconnecting from you. They're no longer looking at you. They're no longer engaging with you, and that's not going to be helpful. And then sometimes you get stories that take forever, and ever and ever and ever and ever. And that's not helpful too, right? So in a sort of an interview scenario, you might have a good couple of minutes to tell your story, which is plenty of time, but you don't want to spend 5 minutes. I've had an 8-minute answer to a question about give me an example of a time, and I let it go because I wanted to give in this mock interview sort of feedback on that. But obviously you want to manage that much more effectively so you can get to the point faster. So we're going to go back to this concept of STAR stories. We've touched on this in some of the previous sessions. STAR stories is an acronym for situation, task, action, result. It gives you a nice story narrative, a story arc for your answers that are going to be effective. Now, I don't like the word task because task sounds like something you have to do, not something you want to do. I prefer the word challenge, but that changes the acronym from STAR to SCAR, which sounds terrifying. So obviously it works better when it's STAR, but the challenge is sort of what you want to think about. The challenge is the drama about the situation that you've been in and what you've done. And again, it follows a story arc, right? The situation is the beginning, sets you up. The challenge is the tension, the drama that allows you to demonstrate the problem solving that you're bringing. The action is what you did to overcome that challenge. And then the result sort of takes you down to demonstrate sort of the impact of your action. So overall, the situation is important to give you context, but you don't want to spend too much time on that because that's just setting up the story. The challenge is the drama. You want to spend most of the time on the action part because that's what you bring. And then the result sort of solidifies how important that action was. So the situation, when, who, with what, being part of a team doesn't help. Is it a team of 5 people, 2 people? Are they in the same discipline? Are they all students, postdocs or whatever it is? So be specific as much as possible, just so that you're answering all the interviewer's questions. The task, again, the challenge, what was the problem? Why was this innovative? Why did you have to do this? Why was it exciting and challenging at the same time? The action, when you think about this, make sure that it's your action, right? So even if you're part of a team, there's something that you contributed to as part of that team. So don't just say, well, we did this and we did that, because then I can't tell your contribution to it. So make sure you might say, this was a team effort, but my particular input to the team was to do this, this, and this. And then the result sort of, again, identifies how effective this all was from the perspective of the project that you were doing. The idea with the situation then is to paint a clear enough picture so that the interviewer has no questions. Because as soon as I have questions about the situation, I'm no longer actually listening to the narrative that you're giving. My brain is just circling around trying to figure out where this was, what it was. I might start looking at your resume to figure out what's going on. If you're coming from a field that is different from the one that you're interviewing for, you may have to define some of the terminologies or the projects, but you don't necessarily need to describe, the department name or the project name as it is, if it's not relevant to the role that you're going into. You might just need to abbreviate it or just say it was this type of project. Enough information to give the reader something to go on. So in the first 6 months of my last role, so this is like a professional version, I was a project manager on a team of 5 marketing analysts focusing on a portfolio of 5 new digital products, right? So it gives me context, it gives me people, it gives me when. The task or the challenge is why it was hard. That's the drama, right? There were some company-wide layoffs. My team lost 2 positions. Of the 3 team members who remained had to take on more responsibilities. This was a significant increase in the workload, led to poor morale. There was also more small mistakes being made because the team was spread so thin. So that's the challenge, right? So the challenge is what hooks people into a story. It's like, oh, that does sound challenging. I wonder what happened. And then that's where the action comes in and relieves that challenge. What you did, why you took it, so you can give some internal monologue into why you thought about this, the approach that you did, why you ended up choosing that over another approach. That's helpful to see how you think and how you work in these contexts. And it shows multiple skills in action, right? So your collaboration, your communication, your teamwork, your strategic thinking, all of those concepts can be brought into the experience that you're describing. I focused my efforts on ways to work smarter, not harder. I brought the team in for a brainstorming session. I advocated for my team by highlighting their successes. I gave everyone a chance to take a role in the brainstorming. So again, I was collaborative in my approach. We identified and came up with 3 recommendations that we then worked on. And then I reached out to senior leadership and I advocated for resources that we got, and that made it successful, right? So many skills here that really speak to the role that this person played in this, in overcoming this situation. And then the result, everyone felt more empowered. We got 2 successful ideas that were applied. Leadership asked me to share those ideas with other people. We've automated some software, we've done some things. So again, that nicely wraps up the story so that you can see not only the skills that you used in real time, but the outcomes associated with that. People love people who can use skills to achieve goals, right? And that's what you're trying to solidify in these results. Now, there's what you did in these star stories, and then there's what you thought about. And sometimes the what you thought about, what was in your head, goes unmentioned. And I would always suggest that there's some element of that that's helpful. So the 2 additional elements that I might add to star stories are the sort of the emotions, right? What you experienced as part of that, why you found that exciting or in a sort of engaging, and then the relevance of the story that you've just told to the job. So you tell your story, and then you might say, and I know this is something that's important at your organization, and then you can explain why. So the emotions, right? Talk about that sort of, remember those emotionally resonant language. I found this so exciting, right? It was really satisfying to see this. So you can give people insight into the way that you think and the way that you approach these things, not just the actions that you took, because both things are critical, right? If you have good judgment and good instincts, for example, then people might see value in that as well. And then the relevance, as I said, connecting it right back to the roles that you're applying to, so people can see how the stories that you have, even if they come from different contexts, are entirely relevant to the role that you're applying to. Someone asked a question about, how old can you sort of go, well, how long can you go back in time to pull out stories that are relevant? And sort of, there's no one answer to this question, but I would say sometimes if the experience is really relevant, then going back in time and telling that story is perfectly fine. What I would add to that, though, is to say, try then to connect that story with something that, or that skill set with something that happened more recently in a more recent setting that just may be less relevant, right? So you might approach it in 2 ways. You might say, well, let me give you an example from most recently where I used the skill in different situations, but then let me take you back to another scenario where, I was in a context that was very much like this role here. So you get the best of both worlds by sort of making sure that you have, really relevant experience, but also experience that sort of is current experience that you're selling right now. So whether you start off with the most relevant one that's further away, or the one that's most recent but less relevant, and then go to the other one, I can make an argument for both of those. But that would be my approach to sort of making sure that you are connecting, your rich, diverse experience with the role, but drawing from the past as well as the present. Which sort of gets to our next point in terms of which stories should you say, right? Should you give? And the answer to this one is probably, on top of what I just said, the stories that you're most excited by are the ones that you should tell, right? Those will come across in an interview as the ones that bring the most energy to the room, right? If you're excited about this experience and you want to talk about it and you can make it relevant, then it's going to come across in a really energizing way for your interview. Once you've thought about the stories that you want to tell, so imagine in an interview, you're going into an interview in person or virtual, and everyone just sits there silently, all the interviewers, and they don't say anything. What would you tell them, right? What stories would you just volunteer to them to get them excited by you? That's how I might approach coming up with these stories and doing some of the prep work. And then I might think about how to sort of write these down so that you can pitch them. We'll talk about big interviews in a bit. They have a star story builder that you can use, but you can sort of create your own sort of narrative here, a piece of paper that just writes down some bullet points about each of these sections, and that allows you to say, well, which of these competencies or skills does this story allow me to talk to? Because you can take any story and you can sort of rotate it around slightly, and it can be a leadership story or a collaboration story or a communication story, because they're all integrated. So one story could cover many answers. You don't want to use the same story over and over again, but depending on the question that you get, you might be able to use the same story to answer that. So if you come prepared with 3 or 4 or 5 stories that you're most excited to talk about, you might be able to answer 10, 15 other questions based on some aspects of those stories that you have. And then if you really want, you can stick those sort of summaries right behind the computer screen if you're doing a virtual interview, so that you can ponder on them. Someone says, give me an example of a time. You're like, sure, let me think about that. And you look out into the distance, but really you're just looking at your wall and you're finding the story that, reminding yourself of the story that you want to tell, and then you tell it. You don't read off the things, but they're just there to remind you about the key takeaways and the different structures of the narrative that you're going to say. So not necessarily best practice, but certainly I have done similar things in similar scenarios, and I found it to be helpful. We talked about this earlier as well, positive and negative leaning questions, right? So you can have positive questions, give me a time that you were part of a team that was successful, and then a time that you're part of a team that went horribly wrong. And you sort of have to be ready to approach both of these, but to a certain extent, the answer that you want to give, the positive story that you want to tell, is always going to be part of even a negative leaning question. And what I mean by that is, the way that I would answer a question that is negative leaning, give me an example of a time that you were part of a team that didn't go well at all, is obviously you don't want to tell that story and go, yeah, that was terrible, and then leave it like that, right? You want to leave it on a positive note. So give us a short star story on the situation that went terrible, and then use that sort of what you learn from it approach, right? So yes, this was a really big learning experience for me. What I took away from that was X. And actually that's been really helpful, because in a recent experience that I had as part of a team, I was able to use that skill to do something, for example, and then you go into a star story that is a positive version of that same sort of competency, collaboration in this case, where you might be then able to sort of leave on a positive note, because you're saying, yes, it went badly, but I learned this, and here's how I've applied it. That would be my overall strategy. Easy for me to say when I'm not actually interviewing, but if you can mimic that, I think you'll be in a good position. Okay, we're running close to time here, so let's run through some of the other stuff. So just before you're ready, make sure, obviously, all your technology works. We're all well practiced in this and aware that technology sort of falls off when you need it the most. So have a plan B. Make sure when you're setting up interviews, you can say, if I lose internet, would you like me to call you? Here's my number if you need to call me if there's some issue, right? So try to be helpful in many situations. Obviously, try to be in a position where your stuff doesn't fail if you're doing it virtually. During the interview, again, you need to be prepared in terms of how you're setting up your space. I would say lighting is your #1 priority. You need to be well lit. My office here is better lighting than my office at Penn. And so, I appreciate this lighting here, but spend lots of time getting the lighting right. I know it's hard if you don't have the space to do that, but it's really helpful. something in the chat. Yes, the recordings will be shared, so they'll be on the Penn Services YouTube channel. Once they're edited, you'll get a notification if you subscribe to that channel. I'll also send out a notification to everyone who registered that those videos are ready. Make sure you turn everything off, including children and animals, as much as possible so they don't interrupt you. Questions you can expect, we covered those. Challenging questions, be ready for questions about salary. We're not gonna have time to cover that today, but it's an important one. And then questions to ask them, obviously keep them focused on your interest in the role. You want them to know that you're interested by asking questions that are about the role. Tell me more about the projects that you're working on. What does the team look like? What does success look like for the person in this role? Just keep asking those types of questions and they'll feel that you're as engaged as possible. And then after, don't forget this, you'll need a thank you email. In my office, everyone's very keen on making sure that everyone we interview sends a thank you email. Because we talk about that to students all the time anyway. So it doesn't have to be long. It can be really short. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It was great to hear X, where X was that was something that person told you. I appreciate the next steps. If you don't have everyone's email, maybe everyone was just brought together at the last moment. Certainly you could send one email to the main point of contact and say, please pass this on to everyone else. I really appreciate the time when I wasn't able to catch their emails. That's fine. Don't do it in the first 10 seconds after the interview. That's kind of weird to sort of, say thank you everyone and then leave, and then you send an email saying thank you everyone. Give it an hour or so, but within 24 hours to make sure that gets in their inbox. Let's finish up with some resources then for you. On the Career Services website, we do have a whole interviewing page with all our interviewing resources on that. That includes things like the management consulted tool that helps you do prep for case interviews for consulting, and also just general interviewing materials. We put together an interviewing guide for graduate students and postdocs. Again, all of these links are in the link that I'm sharing you, or in the box folder that I'm sharing you right now. That's just a great overview, easy to read, easy to navigate through, so take advantage of that. Big interviews out there, they have video curriculums on managing interview questions. So you should really, this is Big Interview is the platform for preparing for interviews. You can use the STAR story builder to sort of create your stories, to go through these different sections, to sort of keep your mind focused on what parts of the story that you are covering with your information. That helps you just be more structured in that way. So take advantage of that. You can also do practice interviews on Big Interviews. So you can find these pre-recorded interview sets where someone comes up on the screen and goes, so tell me about yourself. And then you can record your answer to that, re-watch it so you can get a sense of how it sounds from your perspective, but also share that with your peers and colleagues and everyone else to get their input on that recorded interview. So that's a really nice tool as well.